Welcome everyone to the 5th Annual Cvma National Issues Forum. I am Dr. Henry Seelan, a large animal practitioner from Eastern Ontario and the chair of the National Issues Committee of the Cvma. At previous forums, we have engaged veterinary team members from across Canada and around the world on topics important to our profession, including dog importation, telemedicine, cannabinoids in veterinary medicine, and alternative veterinary medicine. This year, the forum will explore veterinarians as leaders on adaptation to climate change. As you can see, the subjects we tackle at our forums are challenging, critically important to our profession and team members, and this year in particular, of great significance to all Canadians, to our patients, our environment, and our planet. How we as a profession can help lead in adapting to climate change is of significance today and will remain so for decades to come. Cvma has taken what we have learned at the forums and turned ideas into action, including developing positions and leading advocacy efforts that have resulted in changes that benefit our patients, our clients, and our colleagues. This is the first time we have done an online forum, and we are excited to open up a discussion on this year's topic with our largest convention registration ever. Cvma has used online tools to engage with members during COVID on a number of topics, and we hope to continue this into the future, including by hosting a combined in-person and online annual national forum. As chair of the National Issues Committee, I'd like to invite you to explore other ways you can engage with your colleagues on important matters that impact our profession. Cvma has many volunteer opportunities on committees and working groups. Please get involved with Cvma, the only national organization that provides a voice for our profession. We would love to have you join us. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Katie Clow, an assistant professor in One Health in the Department of Population Medicine at the Ontario Veterinary College, University of Guelph. Her research focuses on the ecology and epidemiology of vectors and vector-borne zoonoses. She also conducts research more broadly on One Health. Dr. Clow holds a Doctor of Veterinary Medicine from the Ontario Veterinary College in 2011 and a PhD in pathobiology in 2017. She has worked in private small animal practice as well as at the national and international level in One Health through internships at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the Department of Food Safety, Zoonoses, and Foodborne Disease at the World Health Organization, and the Global Disease Detection Branch of the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention. Dr. Clow regularly collaborates with public health professionals and veterinarians in private practice and industry. Dr. Clow will introduce today's topic and our three esteemed panelists. Dr. Clow, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Seelan, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to the 2021 National Issues Forum. As Dr. Seelan mentioned, each year the Cvma chooses an issue pertinent to the veterinary community and provides a space for learning and sharing. In order to situate ourselves for this year's topic, I first want to share some photos. These are photos that most of us have seen as we've watched the news or scrolled through our social media feeds. These are also photos that many of us have been deeply troubled by, especially since we have taken an oath to protect animal health and welfare. The first image was taken at the beginning of what will go down in history as the horrible year of 2020, where much of southeastern Australia was ravaged by forest fires. We were flooded with images of burning koala bears and dehydrated kangaroos. Sadly, these images continue to replay themselves, and we are dealing with extreme forest fires in many areas of North America, including in Canada. In this photo, we see a polar bear on a small patch of sea ice. Sea ice loss, which has been occurring at a frightening rate, makes it difficult for this iconic northern species to hunt and survive. Catastrophic flooding has been reported at increased rates around the world. Right now, Western Germany and surrounding areas are grappling with some of the worst flooding in centuries. This photo was taken in Texas following the massive storm of Hurricane Harvey. And here we see another photo from Texas, and this time of an extreme cold weather event. And so this image shows cold-stunned sea turtles, which were fortunately rescued from the ocean. And so we know that all of these images have something in common. They are all connected one way or another to a changing climate and the climate crisis. And they depict impacts that we have and will continue to see on animal health and welfare, as well as human and ecosystem health. But fortunately, our news feeds have also been flooded with images like this one. Calls for action for systemic change to address the climate crisis from around the world. People stepping forward and being active players in the fight against climate change. And so that brings us to the topic for this year's National Forum: Veterinarians as Community Leaders for Adaptation and Mitigation to the Climate Crisis. Our forum will begin with presentations from 3 outstanding leaders in the field. Dr. Jonna Mazzett will kick off the presentations with Converging Crises, Veterinarians on the Front Lines. This will be followed by Dr. Courtney Howard, and she will share her experiences with mobilizing the medical profession to take action against the climate crisis. We will conclude with Dr. Craig Stephen and building a climate change action agenda in veterinary medicine. Following these presentations, the forum opens up for questions and discussion. I want to emphasize that this forum is meant to be a dialogue and that your contributions are important and valued. In order to facilitate this, there's a question voting tab on the Chime platform, and your questions and comments can be placed at any time throughout the presentations and the question and answer session. If you do have a question that's specific to a speaker, please preface your question with the speaker's name so we can direct the question appropriately. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Mazzett to kick off our forum. Dr. Mazzett is the Vice Provost of Grand Challenges and the Chancellor's Leadership Professor in Epidemiology and Disease Ecology at the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. Her work focuses on global health problem solving for emerging infectious diseases and conservation challenges. She is active in international One Health education and service and research programs, most notably in relation to pathogen emergence, disease transmission among wildlife, domestic animals and people, and the ecological drivers of novel disease dynamics. She is the founding executive director of the UC Davis One Health Institute, the co-director for the US Agency for International Development's One Health Workforce for the Next Generation, and the director emeritus of the PREDICT project. She was elected to the US National Academy of Medicine in 2013 in recognition of her successful and innovative approach to emerging environmental and global health threats. So welcome, Dr. Mazzett.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm incredibly honored, as for the 3 decades of my career, I've always been looking to the amazing environmental education that I believe the Canadian veterinary medical system provides. And I know that we as humans on this planet have been dramatically changing our environment since the beginning of civilization. And unfortunately, we're really feeling it now. So I think this is a very appropriate topic for this forum, and am again honored to be here. So I wanted to just start out and recognize that so much of veterinary medicine evolved to protect the food supply. But even now, our food supply is in question. We have many people around the world, including in all of our home areas, who are food insecure. Graduate students, for example, are often food insecure. Sometimes we joke about having the top ramen, but it isn't really funny that our planet is facing a food crisis. I think that as we all think about pollination and we know about beehive collapses, we need to take these these things as critical warning signs. And now even in our everyday lives, we can notice changing climate. And that is very shocking. We have wildfires occurring, just as Dr. Klaus said, all over the world. And we're going to need to figure out what we do as a population to keep ourselves safe and to continue to exist on this planet. When we're thinking about that, obviously we're veterinarians and we're worried about this huge impact that we are seeing on the planet, and we're in the midst of this sixth mass extinction of plants and animals. And I think we will be faced as a profession and asked how we can contribute to saving species, and which species are so conservation dependent that we have to let them go. Of course, none of us want to think about that, but it's unclear and very doubtful that most species will be able to adapt as quickly as their environment is adapting. And so again, Dr. Klaus showed you the polar bear. We're going to talk a little bit about the Arctic here today, because we absolutely can observe in real time the climate crisis and the changing environment in the Arctic, but that doesn't mean that it's not impacting all of us around the world. So these species, some of whom are mentioned, are climate refugees, but so are we as people. This is another map for another animal species, humans, and the climate refugees that we're seeing around the world from storms and drought, not to mention wildfires, again, that are plaguing many of our home areas. So I'd just like to start with a little veterinary story about really how can we make these correlations to climate change to the world, and especially your clients, because you are a leader in your community. There are so many direct effects of climate change, but the timelines for these are often so protracted that the average citizen thinks, how can I really make a difference? What can I do in my life that's going to change the tack of this horrible path we're on? And what I'd like to say is we can document and we can make the arguments that help us to explain and show evidence that life on this planet is changing. And one area where I've been able to be involved is together in the Pacific Northwest. We were starting to see diseases that really weren't looking right to us in sea otters, in stellar sea lions, in other species, and we were concerned. And what happened was obviously a veterinary investigation that led us to recognize that it appeared that new pathogens were coming into the Pacific Ocean, never before seen in the Pacific Ocean. So we were documenting, again, in those threatened and endangered species that get monitored more closely, that there was phocine distemper virus that was really only seen in the Atlantic and in Northern Europe, but there it was causing dramatic declines and had been causing dramatic declines in seal populations. By looking at and tracking serologically backwards into archives that, again, veterinarians and conservation biologists were collecting of our marine mammals, we could start to see when these new pathogens were being introduced. And we could overlay that with sea ice changes in the Arctic. So on the right here, on the left, you see all these overlapping species distributions, but on the right, we have the sea ice, and you can see that the sea ice was closed in that top frame in September of 1988, and then jump ahead to 2005, you can see clearly that there is the ability for species to migrate from one ocean to another that never had the ability to do that before, at least as long as we've been monitoring them with modern science. And to be able to document that helped us, obviously, to understand what was going on in those populations that we were worried about, but maybe bigger picture, it allowed us to actually show a direct effect of a health issue, not necessarily in humans in this way, right? But a health issue transferring as a direct result of climate change. And in order to more fully document that, we actually collaborated across many agencies and organizations to look at and get more telemetry done on those different species, the species that might be the bridge that that go between now and the Atlantic and the Pacific. And so we were able to look at many species and identify, yes, that they were actually transiting across the previously closed iced areas. And so when we think about this climate change issue, of course, just now I'm speaking to you about ice loss. Ocean acidification is another one, but this is just a little exemplar of the kinds of changes that we see with changes in migration patterns. Now, many people, another easier demonstration is to think about vectors. And so when we think about vector-borne diseases, obviously vectors are very closely tied to their climatological niche. And if you change that climatological niche, you are changing the vector distribution and the diseases, the vector-borne diseases that they carry. But this is not just limited to vectors, it's just easier for us to observe in vectors. Certainly diseases of domestic and wild animals and plants and humans are also a big concern. And what I would like us to walk away with today is the knowledge that all of these things are completely connected. We are disrupting the synchrony between interacting species by our actions for centuries that are causing this climate crisis. And I do believe that we have the intellect, the potential, everything we need scientifically to act on this and hopefully slow, if not reverse, the change that we have already been observing. But we need to absolutely act now. And we need the evidence base to convince our colleagues, your clients, our friends, our families, that that's the right thing to do. And we have that capacity because we have those examples in veterinary medicine. And as we know, we are very vulnerable. So we can't talk about the crises that veterinarians are helping to face and what the world is experiencing without thinking about COVID-19. And I have been working in emerging infectious diseases in places like this all over the world for more than a decade. And I can tell you that the drivers of climate crisis and many other crises that we're experiencing are the same, one and the same as that are driving our exposure and increased risk to emerging infectious diseases. Now, we can't eliminate every contact, we can't protect every species, but we can think more holistically about how we tread on this earth, interact on this earth, and get ourselves into trouble. And from an infectious disease perspective, that's how we get ourselves into exposure risk. So I'm so pleased to be here with you all today, thinking about and talking about One Health, or that interesting activity where we holistically come together to try to on some of the world's most wicked problems. For emerging infectious diseases, the vectors I already mentioned, the wildlife I already mentioned, they are changing their distribution patterns, but we are also, back to that food supply issue, dramatically changing the way we produce and interact with food, especially in this case, our domestic animal species, who can be hosts and evolutionary changing mixing vessels for some of the organisms that humans just haven't been exposed to in the past. And so it is from this kind of green area, the zoonotic pool of viruses that we don't have evolutionary history with, that we expect these pathogens like SARS-CoV-2 to spill over either directly into people or into other intermediate hosts where they might cook along, maybe even change a bit before spilling into people. And so what I really want you to know is this is not a desperate situation either. We have the ability to change our behavior, think ahead. Instead of waiting for the next infectious disease to hit us and not having any way to really control it until it's moving and dying out, we can be ready, we can forecast, we can improve our detections, our surveillance systems, our laboratories, so that we can jump in and respond. And I had the honor, sorry, it's not advancing. There we go. I had the honor of working with people in more than 30 countries around the world over, again, more than the past decade to do just that. We were able to infect, I like to say, almost 7,000 individuals with the One Health approach, training both laboratorians and field folks and veterinarians and policymakers and public health professionals to really think and get ahead of the curve, if you will, for emerging infectious diseases. And by doing that, we sampled 164,000 individuals, mostly wildlife, but also domestic animal and people. And we trained more than 60 laboratories to do viral detection and discovery, so they don't have to wait for a box to be able to be checked on a form when you submit a blood sample to say, what is in this sample? What is making my patient sick? And while we were doing that, we were developing all these protocols. We also discovered a lot of virus. We discovered novel viruses, more than 160 new coronaviruses, almost 1,000 new viruses in viral families that can cause disease in people. And also documenting more than 200 known viruses in new areas and in new species to help us understand that exposure map and change our behavior and how we relate to those species. Now, we didn't end up finding SARS-CoV-2 before the horrible spillover, but we did find so many other viruses that gave us clues into how to control SARS-CoV-2. We weren't working in the area of China where it emerged, but I can tell you that we found many Sarbeco coronaviruses and the SARS-related coronaviruses, and we could tell the public health community that they should be looking in rhinophilid and hippocytarid bats, because that's where the majority of these viruses were being found. We also could start to document, again, the patterns of host range, home range, and migration of these species and say, hey, it's not just up here in this part of China where we need to be worried about this, but it's all through Southeast Asia and parts of South Asia where we are sensitive to these SARS-related coronaviruses or vulnerable, not vulnerable to the virus, it's not going to leap out and get us, but vulnerable to our own behavioral changes that are putting us at risk. And in just as an example, in Vietnam, we were able to work with hunters, trappers, farmers, restaurant workers, and find that coronaviruses were in about 20% of the rodents where people were hunting for rodents for food or bringing them in for farming for food. And then when they got to the large markets and were traded and were put into dense circumstances, this is not a surprise to any veterinarian, but it seems to surprise the general public that you crowd animals together, they get more infectious diseases, they get stressed, and you mix them with other species, they're going to find viruses that they may not have been exposed to, available for remixing, available for infection. The very scary part is by the time we got to the restaurant, the prevalence in those rodents being butchered at the restaurant and fed to people was that over 50% of them were infected with coronaviruses. So this COVID-19 pandemic is devastating. It's terrible. We're living with it, but it is not going to be the end if we don't change our behavior. And the climate crisis is not going to end if we don't change our behavior. All of the behaviors that are causing these dramatic crises are linked, and they are interactive with each other. And so when we use this One Health collaborative approach, we also need to be bringing in all of the disciplines that we sometimes don't think about, including social scientists. All of us probably know now that we should have done better with communications, right? And we should have been thinking about how people receive information. You are at that front line. You are in your community. You are a leader in your community. And we really hope by the end of this forum, we can convince you to be an advocate for change. And one way to do that is continue to grow the next generation. I'm very pleased to be working in One Health education. We're doing a short course right now called RX One Health. We usually do it in Tanzania. We had to adapt it to California, and now we had to move it because of wildfires at the last minute. So they're really immersed in these crises because they're being shifted constantly. And then down below, you can see we're working in, again, countries all throughout Southeast Asia and Africa to bring together all the different disciplines, veterinarians, epidemiologists, yes, but also physicians, nurses, environmental advocates, pharmacists. And we really have the ability to use our talents, our education, our science to promote change. And I think I'll end it there because I can't advance the slides anymore, and I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mazzett, for that excellent presentation and starting us off with such a great foundation. And now I want to welcome our second speaker, Dr. Courtney Howard, to our virtual stage. Dr. Courtney Howard is an emergency physician in Yellowknife and a clinical associate professor in the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. She's an internationally recognized expert on the impacts of climate change on health and in the broader field of planetary health. Her contributions to planetary health are extensive. She is the first author on the 2017 to 2019 Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change briefings for the Canadian policymakers, as well as the 2018 International Policy Director for the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. Dr. Howard was the first female board president for the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, or CAPE. She has also sat on the boards of Ecology North, the Canadian Medical Association, and Health and Harmony, represented CAPE on the board of the Global Climate and Health Alliance, and being the co-chair of the Advocacy Subcommittee of the WHO Civil Society Working Group on Climate Change and Health. She has also sat on the steering committee of the Planetary Health Alliance and the editorial advisory board of the Lancet Planetary Health. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Howard here with us today, so welcome, Dr. Howard.
Thanks so much for having me. And it's really great to see this level of collaboration between veterinarian science and medical science. I appreciate it. As was just said by the last speaker, this is multidisciplinary work, and the more we're all discussing these issues with one another, the better. So I'm here in Tenaxa traditional territory in what is now known as British Columbia, in my cousin's basement, which explains the very exciting backdrop that you see. And hopefully the tech will all work well and a small child won't burst through the door. So I did my first learning about climate change as a new emergency physician. So I had just graduated from McGill. I wanted to work for Doctors Without Borders, and I was on my way north to Inuvik, which is north of the Arctic Circle. And I happened to pick up a book on the oil sands in the Edmonton airport. And I had not read anything about climate change whatsoever. I was a dancer. I thought I was going to be an athletic, sort of a sports med doc. But on my way north, I realized that as I was reading this book, I had not been taught about the biggest emergency. And I got off the plane in Inuvik. It was the middle of the winter. The internet was very slow. I did a lit review and happened to just pull up the Lancet's first commission on climate change and health, which said that climate change is the biggest health threat of the 21st century. And I was quite angry, actually, at all of the universities where I'd spent my 20s for not teaching me about that university, but at the same time, very grateful for the people who had done the work. And so I went around asking people, and some of you may experience this if this is one of your first interactions with this topic, or possibly also with all the wildfires and the heat that's coming. When you look at the psychological reaction of somebody who's first experiencing what's called a normative conflict, so a new awareness that the world is not where it needs to be, the tendency is to talk to everybody about it. So I did that in Inuvik, and it turns out that Inuvik is actually 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it was when an 80-year-old elder was born. So I actually took the photo in the background of the slide there on my way from Inuvik to Ecological, which is a little nursing station on a sandbar in the Mackenzie River. And you can see that that river in the photo is in fact just freezing. So it was just the beginning of winter. That river is actually a highway for people once it's frozen. And so it's how people cheaply transport goods and building supplies. It's how people hunt. It's very expensive up there. And when you talk to the elders, they say, look, all our traditional foods are moving around. So in fact, at one point a couple of years ago, I now live in the subarctic. We flew all people down from all of the little communities, and we sat around a table in Yellowknife, which is the sort of big center where we live. And we had a picture of the territory. And we asked people to draw on this paper picture of the territory what changes they'd seen in their lifetime. And so we had elders from Tuktoyaktuk, from Port McPherson, from all these different places, basically drawing arrows all over the place. So the beavers used to be here, now they're over here. The good fish used to be here, now they're here. I saw a moose over here. I've never seen that before. My husband saw it. And so by the time we were done, the entire map was just crisscrossed with different arrows. And so we're warming at one of the most rapid rates in the world. That's what the people who know the land best describe. And so to just give you a sense of where we're heading, as the rest of the world starts to warm to a greater degree. Here in Canada, we're warming at double the global rate. In the north, we're warming at triple the global rate. We're going to see more species moving to different places. And of course, as you know, that leads to more potential for different interactions between species and vectors and also people. And of course, potential for zoonotic disease spillover. So there's really a lot going on. I'm trying this super fun slide advance. It works, yay! And so I literature yesterday, and it was sort of fun to I popped up talking about this. So congratulations to everybody. And I wanted to just make sure that I was addressing what seemed to be what people wanted to talk about. And I was really glad to see some of these ideas in this publication. So the idea that veterinarians need to be part of the dialogue, that we need to talk about food systems management, conservation, animal welfare, public health, and the disruptive leadership is required. And I will go into that more in terms of what we've done here in the medical world. And I like your core ideology for the veterinarians' climate change vision to be a steward of healthy animal populations and biodiversity as they relate to ecosystems and society. These are very aligned with what we've been talking about in terms of human health. So when I first became an emergency doctor, I really thought that time learning how to be an emerge doc. And as you heard, I realized later that that wasn't the whole thing. And so I now understand essentially that we live in what I often refer to as a planetary health nest. And so as you describe this to people, you'll find that people really have their thinking in boxes. And this is one of the best ways I've found to describe it to people. So I talk about the ecological determinants of health as being things like soil, water, the climate, different energetic inputs, and that being the platform upon which we build financial structures, societal structures, and those give rise to what we refer to, at least in the medical professions, as the social and structural determinants of health. And those, if that's all going really well, and we can staff and supply and have electricity working, we get to have a healthcare system for people. And when you think about that, you know, in medicine, we sometimes our ego gets away from us and we think we have more to do with the overall health outcomes for people than we do. But really, when you look at studies from across nations, healthcare itself really only accounts for about 25 to 25% of overall health outcome. And so what this slide really communicates to people is that there are so many different inputs into people's health, and that our ability to provide healthcare not only is only a minority component of the overall health outcomes, but it is utterly dependent on everything else functioning. And this used to be tough to get across to people because we had this feeling of sort of non-vulnerability that I think COVID has actually disrupted. So when we talk about supply chains now, people are like, oh yeah, we had supply chain problems, PPE, vaccines, et cetera. So in some ways, COVID, I think, has helped us get to the point where we're almost ready for this conversation, which we weren't before. If you find this helpful, it's in a publication, The Lancet Planetary Health. So when we talk about warming curves for Canada, it's helpful to talk about it in terms of the health of a child born today, because people process that, even just the simple math involved in subtracting 20 or 30 years doesn't land in the same way as thinking about the health of children. And the communications of this around the health of children and the welfare of future generations has been shown by climate communicators to be one of the best ways to motivate populations across the political spectrum to action. So this is my standard way of communicating it. So I think about Matthias. This is my sister's best friend, little guy. He ended up actually needing to get evacuated emergently out of Fort McMurray when the wildfire there caused the evacuation of the city. And what is interesting is that, you know, when you talk about children, it just depoliticizes everything. So little Matthias, this is from the Canada's Changing Climate Report, and this information has not landed. So you're going to have to communicate over and over and over and over and over the reality of continued climate change to people, because I think that the mitigation message came through relatively loud and clear. We need to decrease greenhouse gas emissions so the climate won't change further. However, that's not actually where we're headed. As you can see here, we're committed to about 1.8 to 2 degrees Celsius of warming in Canada by 2040, when Matthias is only going to be in his early 20s. As compared to a new baseline established between 1986 and 2005. I have said this at least 100 times in 100 presentations over the last year or so, and every single time the audience looks surprised. That is a giant problem, because I presented to senators, MPs, architects, doctors. We're not taking these predictions into account as we build our new hospitals, our new infrastructure, as we create our new programs. I think that the current wildfires are helping to move the reality of continued warming into our common vision for the future. But just in the last week, Jonathan Wilkinson, our environment minister, said this is a new normal with regards to the wildfires. We are not at a new normal. If you remember one thing from this presentation, please remember that we are not at a new normal, because that would imply a flat line, right? We're not on a flat line. We're on a continuously increasing line. And if we really, so basically the blue line there is the low emissions pathway. So if we hit the ultra low emissions pathway in IPCC, we have a chance of flattening out in the latter part of the century. Right now, we're tracking the red line. We're tracking the high emissions pathway, which here in Canada would see us at about 6.3 degrees Celsius of warming. So we have an adaptation sprint, and we have started to, within healthcare systems, survey different facilities to find out what kind of climate related problems they're already having, because this impacts our ability to actually do our jobs. And so they've detailed damaged infrastructure, stress, mental health, emergency plans being activated, disruption to services like dialysis. There was huge. Fort McMurray Hospital had to get evacuated in a matter of hours. Other BC healthcare facilities were evacuated during the wildfires in 2017. So it's important for us to track these and report them, because it starts to make clear what the actual impacts are to care provision, which is sort of, I've found a whole different level of practical, the practicality of it is really concrete for people, and it makes them motivated to start to work. So I found that this has been helpful, but there isn't a lot of work. Luckily, so CAPE Doctors, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, just joined this Climate Proof Canada coalition that started up just in late June. And I'd really encourage the veterinarians to take a look at their website, because it's actually quite a conservative group who's come together. It's a lot of insurance providers, some of the more conservative NGOs, et cetera. And it's run by actually the former executive director of our group, who's one of the smartest people I know, Robin Hedger. So he's really been doing a lot of advocacy with the different the different parties as they put their potential election platforms together to say, hey, we need a national climate adaptation plan. We need a person who can work between silos in terms of disaster response. We need a different way of collecting data. And so the more of us who are sort of combined with the same asks, the more progress we're going to make. And we just need to keep driving home we are not at a new normal, because this is where we're headed. By 2080, he's only going to be 63, Matthias. Like, this is not old, as I'm 42 now. 63 doesn't seem very old. Like, we need to get going for Matthias. We have so much work to do. And so here in Canada, we've been crappy at this at mitigating greenhouse we've almost increased by 43.8%. And this has to over 10 years ago. They've had cross-party consensus. They've depoliticized a party that's argued. I just want you to know this is possible. And so when we think about this, if you're feeling sad, if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling angry, if you're feeling guilty, please know that is entirely normal. And the more we can be open and honest about those feelings, the better. Because at the end of the day, we know we have the technological solutions we need at the prices that we require for at least the immediate response for both adaptation and mitigation. And so what that means is this is a humans getting along challenge. Like, what we have right now is a human mobilization challenge primarily. And humans do our best work when we come in to have conversations from a centered place. And so you'll find right now that there's energy, there's emotions going everywhere. And as an emergency doctor and you as clinical veterinarians, you do your best work when you're emotionally centered. And so it's going to be necessary for everybody to do their grief work, care, and to really, that is in fact what will take us to our centered place so that we can enter our decision-making spaces and be ready to buffer whatever energy people bring towards us and be as strategic as we would want to be in any emergency response scenario. And this is just a graph showing how much internet searches for eco-anxiety and ecological grief, et cetera, have really gone up in the last few years. So important to realize it could always be worse, right? You could always have horrible dental pain And so it's really, I used to feel like if I wasn't working all the time, I wasn't doing my job. But the reality is that the arms of your children around you, the beauty of the natural world, time to exercise are what's going to give you the energy to do the work with a full bucket. And so as much as you can appreciate the beauty of the present moment, the better. So making a plan, action alleviates anxiety. And this is Nick Watts, my former boss at the Lancet Countdown. As a med student, he would say, we're too young to know what's impossible, so we do it anyway. So, the cynic is always right. The person who says we can't do it is always right, because it's automatically, you stop trying. And so I would encourage you to aim high. Humans can do incredible things. And so who tells the story? It's important to know that we all have pull. So we all have the ability to influence those around us and decision makers. So the previous speaker was mentioning the importance of veterinarians raising their voice. And yes, 100%. Common sort of progress along the advocacy curve is we're freaked out and we tell everybody. And then we think that if we tell people a ton of things, they're going to do something about it. But the thing is, that person doesn't have a clue like what they're supposed to do. And so relaying evidence, I try, and everything I say to you, I have tried. So I did the mistakes, so you don't have to. So just telling evidence to people, like I used to submit motions that had I was the only person at the Canadian Medical Association that had appendices to my motions. Nobody cares. If you're the person at the buffet table who makes them feel sad and guilty, and they're like, I'm gonna go to the bathroom now, you've kind of not quite hit the energetic sweet spot, okay? How you make people feel is actually truly more important a lot of the time than the data you provide, and that's a tough truth for nerds, but it's true. Okay, so if this is what your audience is looking like, you gotta mix it up. And really listen to the communications advice. Get media training before you think you need it. Media works on like an hour-long timeline. If you can't say yes in a couple of hours, you're going to miss the opportunity, and it's hard to get media. You don't want to miss the opportunity. Like, have your next interaction together be media training. It's possible to do over Zoom. It works fine. And you need to each come up with a story about why you're doing the work. Because, there's a reason I started with that story about Inuvik. There's evidence around the trustedness of messengers that up with your personal story of motivation as to why you're doing this, and get used to telling it sort of crisply. That is not enough. You need to work it into policy, and then you need to do advocacy to make that happen in the real world. And that can involve meaningfully targeted action. When I first started doing this, I was like, we need to solve climate change. And Gideon Foreman was CAPE's executive director at the time. He was like, well, what's your target? I was like, what do you mean target? What's a target? And he said, Courtney, you need a target. And so this is how I now understand change making. So you pick a target that you want to change. You get the team together to do the change. You pick that target from an evidence-based strategic way. You have a story to tell about the target. So when we did coal phase out, it was all about preventing asthma exacerbations in children. We weren't talking about greenhouse gas emissions. We were talking about preventing asthma exacerbations. And then you use different tactics, whether it's surveys that you can then report, whether it's press releases, whether it's a protest, whether it's meetings with decision makers, different tactics. Win your target, win it, then tell everybody. Because people actually like to jump on bandwagons. Once you start winning things, you'll be amazed at how many people want to be on your team, okay? So the targets can be chosen at different levels. So I think of it as a ladder of engagement. Micro is individual level practice change. Meso is hospital level. So things we're talking about now in my circles are phasing out anesthetic gases that have a really high greenhouse warming potential, switching to from meter dose inhalers to dry powdered inhalers. So those are departmental organizational change things. And then you tell everybody, it's in the newsletter. They're like, hey, that person over there is doing good things. And then after that, you can choose a bigger target and say, hey, we're going to work on coal phase out. And now you kind of know your stuff because you did the other things. and you've made some of your mistakes where nobody could see and nobody cared, and you're ready for sort of the bigger leagues and to talk to decision makers and media at a different level. So think about it in terms of iterative change making. And some people are really, really good at target selection. And to me, that's the creative fun part of a lot of it. So these are just a few of the things that we've done. So essentially, animals, so I don't really know. And has committed to net zero. It's important for us to do that as well. So and I think that the more you all work together, leading by example makes a difference. Commuting is something that we've done. Phase out, we've been very, very successful with at the national. Important to have very diverse groups at the decision-making and action tables. You'll find people bring different perspectives. If I look around, and so making sure that I look at it now as humanity, something that matters. Jane Philpott's food guide was super, super important, and it wouldn't have happened if she hadn't been there. And in terms of what I would like to see from this community, this report from the National Farmers Union is really worth reading. It is really built around a corporate model that isn't at all helpful for food security or animals. And so the more we can coordinate around food, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation, the better. Because at this point, it's not serving anybody. Important to know that air pollution is truly bad for the world. And right now, doctors this year is that we need to get in front of politicians at least as much as the oil lobby is. Because when we think about trustedness, when we think about feelings, when we think about what makes you change your behavior, it's really the people you know. And so they are really good at this. They've got tons of resources. They're meeting with decision makers about 5 times a day right now. And that's probably why. We, in our recovery packages, have very much continued to subsidize fossil fuels. And that's not something we can do if we want to survive. And we need to make that message really, really clear. This is some made in Canada research about our fossil fuel subsidies. And that can change. I truly believe it can change. The Iron and Earth survey that was just done shows that fossil fuel workers want to change. They want, as they said, people just want to be able to put food on the table for their families. They're very happy to do that in a clean energy industry, but they need the support to do it. And in fact, what they've estimated as the cost of transitioning that entire workforce is less than what we've spent on the pipeline. And so really, we need to be very, very careful in our language. Supporting workers, supporting families is very, very important. But the fossil fuel companies, their bottom line is not aligned with the bottom lines that we've all spent our lives working to promote. And we need to get pretty pointy in our approach to basically countering their political influence, because it's a real crux point. So you've probably seen, this is the donut. We need to start trying to live in the sweet spot, the safe operating space for humanity. And I would imagine also for different types of living beings, animals. And what it's going to take us to get there, the major thing is courage. So I want you to know that this work is going to feel uncomfortable. You're going to be in rooms where people don't think like you, and where you're the only person of your description, and you're going to have to ask a lot of questions. You're going to have to be humble, but you're also going to learn a heck of a lot more than you probably would if you continue to do what you're doing. And when I'm in a room and I'm standing up and I'm delivering an unpopular message and people are looking at me and I'm like, oh goodness, here we are again. What I do now is I actually picture all of the other people who are standing up in rooms around the world and saying something living beings now and into the future that we care about. You might not be able to see them, but they're there. So feel that sense of solidarity. We are all working together. Come find us at CAPE, come find us at the Canadian Medical Association for different opportunities to collaborate. And I really congratulate you on this conversation that you're embarking upon today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Howard. It was really valuable to learn from your experience and sort of translate that into our profession as well. So our final presenter is Dr. Craig Stephen. Dr. Craig Stephen is one of Canada's leading One Health professionals. In addition to providing consulting services to all levels of government, academia, and industry, and the nonprofit sector, Dr. Stephen is a clinical professor at the School of Population and Public Health at the University of British Columbia, and a clinical professor at the Ross University School of Veterinary Medicine. Dr. Stephen has extensive leadership experience in One Health and environmental health, including being the CEO of the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, the founder and director for the Centre of Coastal Health, the scientific director of the Animal Determinants of Emerging Diseases Research Unit, and the founding director of the BC Environmental and Occupational Health Research Network. He has held several faculty positions, including a Canada Research Chair in Integrating Human and Animal Health. He has devoted his career to developing ideas, peoples, policies, and evidence to concurrently promote the health of people and animals and their shared environments. He uses population health and health promotion concepts on a wide set of issues ranging from conservation to global health to emerging threat preparedness. Welcome, Dr. Stephen.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I'm starting this talk feeling a little bit overwhelmed to say something, partly because this light's coming from the side, making it look like some, great idea from on high is going to illuminate me, but also because I've got this unfortunate position of talking about what we should do. And I'll admit to you that on a weekly basis, I teeter on giving up. I look at my career. I have worked on wildlife and wildlife health when in extinction crisis. I've worked on food security. I heard about Jonna talking about food security problems. I've worked on emerging disease issues, and we've got global pandemics, and I've starting to work on climate change, and it seems to get worse, and it's overwhelming, and it's tough to do. But I spent in preparation for this conference, I was asked to do some press interviews on this issue. I did 16 interviews, and at every one of those interviews, the reporter asked, what's something we can do? What's something concrete we can do? So I want to talk a little bit about what we might be able to do as veterinarians. Now, I get worried about this, especially in response to COVID. Everybody's trying to position veterinary medicine to be like this. We're going to stop the next pandemic. We're going to deal with extinction, deal with climate change. There's this One Health that's going to give these great superpowers. But I really worry that we kind of look like this, especially when it comes to climate change. We've got the costume, we've got the intent, but do we have the powers to make something change? Why am I pessimistic about that? Well, I recently completed a review where I looked at over 200 sources over the past 10 years, and I asked, what are we doing in the animal health literature, not just the veterinary literature, about climate change adaptation? So we heard about the need for this adaptation imperative, where things are changing. We have to help animals deal with what might come. 1,300 papers, only 36 actually discuss adaptation, even though we found 1,300 that had it in their titles or they talked about it, like, we need to do this. Of those 36, almost half of them just said, well, there's some animals that will be evolved to do okay. So, Norway rats, which are generalist species, will do much better than some species who are highly tied to their environment, like, for example, salmon out here. 9 of them dealt with, well, let's make sure wildlife has connected habitat so they can, in fact, get out of the way. 6 of them dealt on domestic animal husbandry, mostly around overheating in barns. 0 evaluated their initiatives to see if they made any difference. So there's no evidence based in literature about something that we could do that we know will make a change. We also looked at government and veterinary association websites. And yes, they recognize the need. We have to deal with climate change. There's very little investment in adaptation action for animals. Animals have a very, very small voice, are almost inapparent in policy, and there's almost no action happening right now, either helping animals to adapt or to protect the social values that animals give society. So I'm kind of worried that we've got the Spider-Man costume on, but we don't have something to back us up with it. So what do we talk about when we look at that literature? This is a little picture that's taken out that talks about the climate change impacts on people. You know, rising temperatures, extreme weather, air quality impacts, vector-borne diseases, and we go down to the bottom. We're going to see things like heat strokes and dehydration and cardiovascular and respiratory disease, injury, and infections. So first off, the literature is very scant on animals and climate change compared to the human health literature, which is still small compared to the size of the problem. But the vast, vast majority of things in the veterinary and animal health literature are just speculating on what could go wrong. Oh, you know, Lyme disease is going to go further north, or we're going to see this problem in this place. We might see this. A lot of speculation, a lot of possibilities, and a huge bias towards vector-borne disease. There's absolutely no reason to believe that cattle aren't going to be affected by heat stroke. In fact, when we had that heat bomb in British Columbia, you know, dairy cattle in the Fraser Valley, there was a huge impact on their well-being and their production. So we have this very, very biased view, and I partly put that on the heels of the One Health movement, which is fixated on infectious diseases. And as Courtney had talked about, just like animals, our well-being is affected by the world around us, and so are animals. So we've got this very, very narrow view of what we mean by climate change and animal health. So I can't give you, here is the evidence about what we can do. So let's sort of just go back to basics. 2 general climate change actions in the broad sense. Adaptations, you've heard that several times. What do we mean? Okay, it's about adjusting ecological, social, or economic systems in response to actual or expected climate change impacts. So in other words, how do we deal with all the crap that's going to come at us? But mitigation is there as well, and mitigation is reducing or preventing emissions of greenhouse gas. Because you saw that curve of Courtney's going like this, people are kind of forgetting about mitigation because, oh my goodness, we have to do something, we have to adapt to it. But mitigation can't be forgotten in this discussion. This is the way I sort of look at it, the relationship between climate change and health. So there's the animals we're trying to protect. The balance board they're standing on is just their world conditions. And as that slope changes, as the world gets a bit riskier for those animals, they slide toward health impacts. It might be disease outbreak, it might be a fire, it might be their food supply disappears. Some species can hang on better as the slope gets higher. So like I say, a generalist species versus a specialist species. We've got the greenhouse gases at the bottom of the thing pushing the slope up, changing that world faster than the animals could change to adapt to it. And then that tipping point goes to the left or the right more based on what we do and how the social and environmental situations change. So our action agenda is really about a couple of things. First off, right, how do we tip that slope away from harms? So we can do that by reducing and preventing those emissions that are pushing up on the left-hand side. We can recognize how we're shifting the tipping points by what we're doing with, you know, social policy, what we're doing with how we raise our animals, what we're doing with the feed sources we pick, all those sorts of changes. We can try to avoid, detect, and contain those hazards. So let's do new ways of fire. Let's make fire-safe barns. Let's talk about pathogen detection and prevention. And we can help animals deal with that slope, make them stickier if you'd like. Maybe it's genetic selection. Maybe in sub-Saharan Africa we don't use Holstein cattle, but you use, you know, drought-adapted goats, for example, something like that. Or maybe we in fact make sure that those animals have genetic diversity if it's wildlife, or they have habitat connectivity. We give them the ability to hold on as that slope changes. So if we do that, we can think there's sort of 4 entry ports where we could start to act. The first is protect. So we want to do something before harms occur by protecting those determinants of population resilience. What are those things animals need to stay well? Their access for daily living, their capacity to deal with stress, all these sorts of things. Everybody says, oh, we need to act early, we need to protect, and almost nobody invests in it. So we often say, well, let's warn. We heard a lot of that from Jonna. Let's get these early warning systems to find a hazard or a high-risk situation. It's not just bug hunting, it's the situation, because the pathogens don't cause a disease outbreak, it's the situation. So how do we find something that's also going to inspire people to do something different? As Courtney said, just giving them data, finding a virus isn't going to change their behavior necessarily. Well, okay, maybe we didn't warn. So something's happened. How can we make sure it isn't really bad? How can we limit the spread of the problem? How can we limit the impact by clinical response, by population support responses? And then finally, how can we help them recover? After the fire's gone through and the cattle have got burned or the dogs got injured, we have to help the farmer get back, have to help the animal get back. Protect, warn, mitigate, and recover are our 4 entry points generically. So the question becomes, what do we prepare for? 2 things are going to happen with climate change and health. Things we know about are going to be in new places, or they're going to be amplified. So we might see Lyme disease further north in a new place. We might see new pollutants and species because food webs change, or because we have big melting events and that those pollutants get mobilized into water. So new species, new places, new amounts of things we already know about. Leptospirosis in dogs in the Pacific Northwest, something like that. And there's going to be surprises. Climate is a real complex system. So is health. They're going to interact. We're going to see emerging diseases, infectious and non-infectious. We're going to have interactions. The interaction of the extinction crisis and climate change and urbanization, they're going to cause things we don't know about, and we're going to get extremes. And the climatologists tell me they can't predict really what the extremes of weathers are going to be. I'm doing work in the Caribbean right now around climate change, and we were doing one of our sessions where I was in the middle of that heat bomb in BC, and they were in the middle of dealing with a massive hurricane. Nobody sort of saw those coming. So we have to think about, what can we do? Let's see if my slides will go forward. I guess that's the first thing we can do. There we go. So for the expected, for things that we sort of know could likely happen, these known things that might amplify or change the places. Well, after the impact occurs, we can try to get surge capacity to places of extreme events. So a mobilizable veterinary corps, which is challenging when the industry is primarily a private sector service as opposed to a public goods service. But we have to have that ability to share our capacities to help out our fellow practitioners and communities. But we also need to share our knowledge. So when you're seeing something odd happening in your practice, if you're seeing increases in leptospirosis in Kitimat, you need to share that knowledge so people know what you're seeing, and more importantly, what you're doing to make a problem. People are getting warning fatigue. And if we continue just going, it's bad, I've seen a problem, we're going to start getting tuned out. And more importantly, we have to evaluate what works. There was a massive implementation science gap in animal health. We find a risk factor, we tell people do this, and we don't follow up to demonstrate that it works. So that's what we can do after something happens. But before it happens, we have to decrease their vulnerability so that slope changes back a little bit. So what do I mean by vulnerability? There we go. So vulnerability is composed of a few components: your exposure, your sensitivity, and your adaptive capacity. Your adaptive capacity is, can you resist the bad thing when it hits you? And can you be resilient to it? So I put this up because I wanted us to see that this is what you do in private practice. You decrease exposure potentials. How do we house our animals? How do we make sure that we have biosecurity in that animal thing and animal housing, or where we import pet animals from? What do we do for infection control? What do we ensure that the animals have food and water? What do we do for vector control? So we can decrease exposure to infectious and non-infectious threats that way. We can reduce sensitivity. We can do that by reducing their susceptibilities to specific diseases through immunization. We can make them able to deal with new stuff coming by taking care of existing stuff. So how do we decrease current diseases and concurrent stressors? How do we make sure they have those determinants of health, food, water, physical security? For resistance, same thing. You're not going to be able to deal with something new that hits you if you're already dealing with a bunch of pre-existing stressors. And so we have to also think about how we can select for, develop, and match the animal's innate characteristics to its climate reality. Finally, for resilience, how do we think about the animal's genetic endowment? How do we compensate to husbandry, like barns that can cool better? And how do we make sure that the owners of animals have the resources, both knowledge and financial, to deal with these sorts of things? So when I look at this is sort of, in different words, what I did in practice all those many years ago. So this means we have to add the role of health promoters to our traditional role of disease service specialists. As an MD, as a DVM, majority of education is about how to take something that's already ill and return it back to something normal. That's always going to be too late for climate change as our sole strategy. So we have to keep things well. So again, you heard Courtney talk about the determinants of health. That terminology doesn't really exist in animal health, except we do it all the time. This diagram's a model that my team developed for wildlife. When we look at the literature, all the literature that said what keeps wildlife healthy or resilient, it clustered around these ideas. So you've heard me talk about you can't be healthy without your needs for daily living, habitat availability and use, water security, food security. You can't be healthy if you have an abiotic environment that's not conducive to you, a climate that's beyond your adaptive needs, increased pollutants, extremes of weather. You can't be healthy if your biological endowment doesn't meet your reality. So your physiology is a problem. You've got diabetes, you've got other issues going on. You have infectious diseases, your genetics are mismatched. You can't be healthy if your social environment causes too much competition for space, for resources, either competition within or between species. You can't be healthy if you have excessive increased direct mortality, trauma, predation, hunting pressures. And you can't be healthy if you don't meet society's expectations. And that's always a tough one when I talk to health about students, because they think health is this sort of innate thing. But if you think about it, I mean, a healthy dairy herd is based on their productivity. Healthy dogs based on how they meet our needs. So we have these human expectations. So culture, social norms, all those things come together to mean something's healthy. And we have to think about how we work beyond just that one section of disease to keep animals well in advance of these expected changes. So what about these unexpected things, these unimaginable things, the surprises that will come? I can't develop a surveillance program for something I can't expect because they're unexpected. So all I can do is build robustness and resilience so they can cope with what might come. So I have to start targeting these all hazard determinants of vulnerability. So not just focusing on exposure to specific known things, but I've got to get to those concurrent stressors, those other pressures. That might be socioeconomic conditions, depending where you are in the world. It could be ecological for wildlife. It could be deficits in husbandry and health circumstances that will make the animals, less able to cope with what might come. So we need to develop a continuum of care. So we want to avoid premature and excessive or inhumane deaths, and we want to make sure we have optimal health. We want to shift from failing to thriving. So to thrive, we want to keep things well. Things that are doing well, let's keep them well. Let's make sure they have those capacities for being healthy. They have the resources they need. The owners have the capacities to make the good decisions. We create resilience. Well, then if we start getting exposed to risk factors, well, how can we modify those risk factors? By addressing vulnerabilities. How can we create animal care conditions so they're less exposed, they're less sensitive, and they're more adaptable? When harms are already starting to happen, as we're seeing, how can we contain them? How can we reduce the harm through rapid detection and early interventions? And finally, once things are bad, how do we prevent avoidable or premature losses through helping species recover from acute events like fires, replacing animals we might use for our own needs in different places, or replacing the needs animals might have to access through different ways. So we have to have that full continuum of care to actually deal with this, the continuum of harms we're going to see. But it's really not that simple, obviously. It's a messy world. We're talking about climate change as if nothing else is happening out there. Emerging diseases are happening out there. Food trends are happening out there. They're going to change our expectations on animals. Urbanization is affecting wildlife. There's multiple things. They're going to interact with each other. And so adaptation against one harm could in fact affect your adaptation for another. So we can't have a blinkered view that said this is a climate change agenda. This is a health agenda. And there are diverse views. There are diverse values and interests that are going to affect outcomes. The paper of mine that Courtney highlighted there about the response to climate change in the Cvma or the CVJ, I got letters from people saying I'm a shill of somebody, and this is a bunch of hooey, and we're just making up a bunch of stuff about climate change. People have different views and interests out there, and that's going to affect your adaptation outcomes. And I'm not going to judge that, but what it means is you're going to have to understand your local audience. Local knowledge is needed to effectively adapt. What we do for adaptation should not add to climate change. So let's say, let's increase cooling in chicken barns by, burning a coal-burning heat exchanger out back. That doesn't make sense. It shouldn't limit our response to other things, shouldn't constrain us from being ready for a pandemic. And it should make sure that it's not causing undue toll on economies or the natural environment. And of course, it should be effective, efficient, equitable, and evidence-based. And as I said very early in that one review that we did, we have a very scant evidence base on what to do and what will work. But maybe it is simple. So there's a few tasks we can do. To keep animals healthy, you've got to keep them healthy, which sounds stupid, but health is a multi-solving solution. And by health, I don't just mean the absence of disease. I mean, making sure animals have that capacity to deal with what might come. They can meet their needs for daily living. They can cope with changes and stresses. They can meet our expectations. And that's what your clients want. That's what people want. That will help us deal with known as well as unknown threats. Resilient animals, resilient systems by keeping health as that function, health protection, health promotion. Task 2 is stay on top of what's happening. Know what's coming through networking, continuing education. There will be new pathogens showing up. There will be new syndromes showing up. You need to share what you're seeing with surveillance systems and with others, so we're not all reinventing the wheel. It's a big, diverse country. It's a big, diverse world. We can learn from each other. You need to be adaptable. Things are going to change. Courtney was already mentioning some of her talk about things and changes that we're seeing already. We're seeing the same in animal health. You need to be able to mobilize and share your skills. And you have to help your clients create adaptable and resilient settings for their animals. We need to make sure that we're not increasing or encouraging situations that the animals can't deal with, or that we're going to take great energy needs to deal with them and exacerbate the problem. We also need to think about mitigation. We have to look at our own practices. Healthcare is one of the greatest contributors to climate change, particularly in the human health sector. There was a paper I read a while ago that said if you added up the climate footprint of the human healthcare sector, it's the 5th largest climate polluter in the world for countries. So what can you do in your own practice? What can you think about energy use? What about client travel? We've learned a lot through this pandemic about ways you can service your clients without having them always having to drive to you. How do you deal with your waste management? How do you deal with your ordering? There are things that we can look at to start talking about what you can do with your own practices, both as a human being and as well as a practitioner. Advocate. Have a voice to influence public policy and practice. Cvma does what it can, but it's a single voice. Action has to be local. Veterinarians are highly trusted in the communities. If we do not talk about the biggest impending threat to our health, we will become socially irrelevant. And you have a voice that's trusted. We need to be able to talk about it, but not just the sky is falling, talking about what we can do. People have what I call apocalyptic attention deficit disorder. It's overwhelming. Every week I'm quitting my job. It's just too much. It is overwhelming. And so you can't just keep causing about the problems. You have to talk about the solutions. And the fundamental solution is keep animals healthy, given the circumstances of what they need to be well, not just responding to the disease. So that means we have to educate ourselves as a profession about way to be health promoters and protectors, as well as remedying the harms. And you have to help educate your clients on options for their animals, how you can look after them, how they can care for them. We can't wait for perfect knowledge and perfect agreement, the best thing to do. I spend a lot of my time learning from drug addiction, because in drug addiction, there's a thing called harm reduction. And harm reduction says, oh, great, we'd love to get rid of heroin or fentanyl or whatever, but we're not. What can we do now to help people incrementally be better despite that addiction being there? What are the things that we can do that we can agree on to move forward? So you need to find an entry point to inspire action now in the face of imperfect knowledge, in the face of imperfect agreement. What can you do in your household, your clinic, for your clients to start working towards the behaviors, the situations that will decrease our general vulnerability? And you've got to meet your clients where they are. Not all of them are going to be thinking climate change is a big thing. In fact, you don't have to talk about climate change. You can talk about animals being well. A lot of the things you're going to have to do to resist a pandemic, to resist a disease outbreak, to resist anything else, it's the same. We need to be able to have that adaptive capacity, and animals have to be healthy. So we keep focusing on health rather than responding to disease. So you need to be adaptive to your local circumstances and understand how to empower the desired changes that are important to your clients, not just important to you. No one size is going to fit all. You know your client base varies, their needs and values vary. How can you be multifaceted? Better is good. So the only American politician ever quote is that's the Obama quote, right? Better is good. So move it forward. And we need to really attack the drivers of harm and the determinants of resilience. In other words, what are the underlying things that are causing our animals to be more vulnerable and threatening the values they bring to us as society? And that has to be part of the daily work of veterinary medicine. So if I'm wrong, if those people who responded to the article in the CBJ saying I was a shill for the, whatever agenda, all I'm arguing is we need to keep animals healthier, because if they're healthier, they're better able to resist stressors. And health means making sure animals can adapt with their environments. So animals be better prepared for other challenges like pandemics and extreme weather if we're giving them better health, more resilience, more capacity. And in fact, for veterinary medicine, it opens up a whole new line of business as health promoters, not just responders to disease. But if I'm right, time's running out, and as a profession, it's time that we step up and we actually start working proactively to better prepare the animals we're obliged to look after, to make both wild and domestic, to sustain what humans depend on for our well-being. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Stephen. And thank you to all of our speakers for these really engaging presentations. So right now, we're going to enter our question and answer and comment section of our forum. And so as a reminder, on the Chime platform, there should be a question and voting tab, and that's where you can enter any of the questions or discussion points that you would like to bring forward to the panel. And so we've already received some questions, and so I'm going to pose the first question to our group of panelists. I believe this is targeted towards everyone. So as a means to action, can you speak to how a largely private sector, the veterinary profession, can collectively impact policy at each level of government? So municipal, provincial, and federal, and the role that we see for Cvma in helping to set the stage for this.
Oh, I'll jump in. The first thing I'll say is, I'll say it and then I'll retract it. So I'm going to say, forget the Cvma, do it yourself. That's the first thing. I wish I could see the audience and ask you, put up your hand if you've ever written your MP. If you've told them that it's important. I've talked to so many MPs that say, I don't hear from my constituents. They don't write me letters. People think I'm inundated with them. If they don't know you care, they're not gonna act, right? So you need to have a voice to say, this is important to you as a person, this is important to you as a guardian of animal health and well-being. Now, secondly, I think you do encourage groups like the Cvma to say, this is important to us. This is the biggest animal health issue that the next several generations of veterinarians will have to deal with. And it has to be something that you work as an organization to advocate for action, not just complaining about what we do, but actually getting out and saying something. So I think making sure your voice is heard is the most important thing we could do right now.
Yeah, I also just want to build on what Dr. Stevens said, and that you are a trusted leader in your community in all directions. So you are absolutely a scientific leader for your community, for your clients, and you have the ability to learn, absorb, just as you're doing here, and share that. And be a change agent in that community, which you might consider small. I don't know how big your practices are, but you are also an incredibly trusted leader to your MPs. As Dr. Stevens said, develop a relationship with them. You can write them a letter, but guess what? offer your services as a trusted consultant, because I would not want you to ever underestimate that the systems thinking that you have in your education is incredibly powerful when you take the planet as a patient. And so please don't undervalue your talent. I think as veterinarians, we often sort of hide our expertise under a bushel when you actually have amazing ability to influence change and to jump into these conversations locally, provincially, and nationally, and internationally even.
A couple of things. So number one, if you're looking at what we presented and you're going, oh my God, that sounds scary, that's totally normal. And really, I've found that the more we can break down the tasks into skill sets and help people learn those through organizations like the Cvma, the better. So the media training, which 3 points, how to write an op-ed. People put tons of time into op-eds that are 2,000 words long and then get reports back from editors that it's not going to work. So, have a thing like, this is how you write an op-ed. You have to tie it to an issue. It's 700 words long, attach a bio, and a photo. How to talk to your MP. We just mobilized a lot of doctors around Bill C-12, which just passed, and many of them had never written to their MP before. And so we have a Facebook group that we use. We had templates. We had cut and pasted email addresses so that people didn't have to do that work on their own, because vets are super busy, as are doctors. And so the more we can reduce the barriers and the time demand for everybody to participate, the more you'll find that people will participate. And something else, I find that we tend to think that this is going to happen just sort of magically. And in my experience, it requires resources and organization. So for instance, CAPE, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, we have 2 PhDs on staff now. We've got an ops person, we've got a communications person who speaks French and English. Those people are required to mobilize our physician volunteers. The secretariat are the people who keep initiatives driving forwards while we go into the hospital to work our night shift. And so I think for a long time, we've been trying to all do this off the side of our desks, and it just realistically doesn't work like that. I think about how, pharmaceutical industry, big oil, et cetera, do their influencing. They have giant groups of people who do this, PR professionals, media professionals, tons of people. So think about the resourcing. Like, if we're serious about getting this done, we need to make sure.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask a question, but I'm going to encourage, we haven't seen any additional questions come in. So again, please use your Chime platform to enter those questions, and we'll get to them as quickly as we can. So I think this is probably a question for everyone, but I find sometimes conversations in veterinary medicine surrounding climate change can get really uncomfortable when we're talking a lot about food systems and intensive agriculture and sort of the role that veterinarians have with clients in supporting the livestock industry, but also thinking about some of those negative health outcomes that we know exist with certain types of production systems. And so I'm wondering how you approach conversations like that and how the veterinary profession can sort of work forward in that space.
I'll hop up in there. It reminds me of when I used to be a volunteer firefighter, where you're taught about span of control. So if I was on fire attack, I didn't do building ventilation. If I was on rescue, I didn't do attack. Veterinary medicine has this history of trying to do it all, right? So the key is to play to your strengths. There's influence along that whole continuum of care that I talked about. You don't have to be able to do it all. So figure out where you can make an incremental improvement, right? Better is good. And not having to think about the fact that I have to be the one that changes this part of the food system. I have to change that. So how can I, when I'm talking to my client about that particular animal, that particular case, talk about solutions that might be more climate friendly, for example, right? On the other hand, not all of us are going to be going to Ottawa lobbying for the MP. So if identify your span of control, identify your strengths, and play to those, I think is a really important strategy for moving forward. Do not, I mean, I'm old enough, I'm of the veterinary training where you did everything. I mean, this was my anesthesiologist, for my gas machine back in those days. And I did every animal that was out there. But we have to get past that. So figure out where you can make a difference and do that, because better is good.
Makes me want to call Dr. Stephen James Harriet, right? So I just have the little picture in my head. I also wanted to follow up on something that Dr. Howard said, and I think having these conversations are really hard. Many of us have been having horribly hard conversations throughout this pandemic period. We have families divided over vaccines, so many things, these hard conversations that can divide us. Have divided many of us, and we have to think about those. So I want to acknowledge how hard those conversations are, but also take what Dr. Howard said about stories. I think that you can use the illustrative stories, and even though, especially in food systems, our clients are very much about economics and how to afford to do what they're doing and still do it humanely and healthily for all of us. I think that your stories that you bring to them and their desire to do good can't be underestimated in value. And so I've actually been working with veterinary students who say, I don't want to go work for a practice that isn't pushing environmental resiliency, that isn't pushing diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you want to actually be a good model, sharing those stories and finding those clients that may want to have a model system, that may want to say, hey, this may be slightly more expensive, but people are going to want my product even more. So finding those ways to have your practice evolve, but also have your clients' practices evolve in a way that the community around them is going to embrace and support them is really important, because I don't know if the nuance on my first slide, but those crickets are on there because people are going to alternate sources of protein. They're tasting better. They're less, potentially less environmentally impactful, depending on where we go, and accessible. And so everybody's evolving, right? And we need to learn how to do that and be successful and survive from a business perspective, but also as a species.
I'll just jump back in there. I think it's worthwhile saying that you don't have, I'm going to say this, but I'm going to say it wrong. You don't have to say I'm responding to climate change. What you're responding to is keeping your animals well in a changing world. So again, for this project in the Caribbean, we're doing right now around climate change leadership training, there's some concern that people aren't buying into climate change. There's a group in Haiti. No, how can I help your community stay healthy in a changing world? So things are changing. Climate might be driving it, but you don't have to tell people you must respond to climate change. How can I make your herd more resilient to increasing droughts? So for example, one of the people is saying, we need a strategy around this particular issue in this particular nation, the Caribbean. Yes, it's climate driven, but it kind of doesn't matter, because our health has always been driven by the environment and we respond to that. So I think the important thing is to stay focused on the world's changing. It's always changed. We have to adapt to changing pet trends. You have to change to changing food supplies and demands. This is a new change, and we have to respond to the change for those animals and adapt to that, rather than necessarily having to everybody, trumpet around, we have to deal with climate change. Yes, there is. That's why I said that's a continuum of care. If you need somebody out here talking about we need to do something about climate change, but I need to have somebody saying, how do I make it so your animals can be well in the reality that they are facing? So we don't have to always go climate change. If we have a health agenda, how do I keep your animals healthy in this reality? You need to be aware of new diseases that are coming. You need to be aware of how things will interact. You need to be more prepared for disaster. You need, right? So it's just a different world for your practice. And there's nothing wrong. I'm just saying that because I don't want people going guilty, feeling guilty, saying, I'm just doing practice, so I'm not doing climate change. Those two aren't mutually exclusive. You're doing practice for the realities that your animals are dealing with, and tailoring that to what the client values and what the client thinks is important. That will create the change, rather than trying to push a particular climate agenda onto people. So meet the people where they are about what's important to them and help them incrementally make things a little bit better.
That makes sense. And I think that when you start there, when you start with the shared common vision for a positive future, the healthy animal, you can then and sort of establish that as your common ground. That gives you some of that understanding you need to nudge people a little bit. I found that when I first started doing this, especially at the Canadian Medical Association, I would bring forward motions around climate change. And sometimes the doctors from oil-rich provinces would come to me and say, I can't vote for this motion because I feel like I'm voting against my patients. And what I ended up saying was like, look, we know that it is most kind at the end of the day to make sure that people have the information they need to achieve their goals. And this is part of helping people figure out what the future is going to look like so they can position themselves well and their kids well, make sure they make their investments in the right spot. And so as long as they know that this is what you actually care about, as you then relay some of this forecasting, it will help. I used to take it personally when people had all sorts of emotions that came at me when we had these conversations. And now I actually put it in the same basket as when I give people diagnoses in the emergency department. So if I do a chest x-ray and I find a big, likely cancer there, I know that when I enter that room and I sit down, people are going to have all sorts of different reactions. Sometimes they're going to have lots of questions. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're going to laugh inappropriately. Sometimes they're going to leave. Sometimes they're going to want to do lots. And that's all totally normal human reactions to what's essentially bad news. And so just make sure that when you go into that room, you're calm, like you would be, and you're ready to absorb those and just sort of respond as helpfully as you could. I should just mention that in the human health world, there's a real trend towards plant-rich food. And I really try to encourage the words plant-rich as opposed to plant-based. Some of the discussion gets super polarized and it's not helpful at all. And so I think we have an amazing tool in Canada's food guide because it's really promoting a plant-rich diet, but there's still space there for animal proteins. And that National Farmers Union paper really sort of details how they think things can be most productively done in a changing world. And so as you forecast out for some of your clients, I actually own a farm in Manitoba, so I've had lots of conversations with rural Manitoban farmers. I think that those types of things will be very helpful.
I think those are all really excellent points that we can all take home. It helps frame a difficult conversation into some action. Cognizant of the time, I think we have time for one more question and then we'll wrap up. To leave us on sort of a positive note and moving forward into the future, I think this is a question for all. In thinking about our next generation of veterinarians, and Jonna, you've already talked about this quite a bit, how should we adapt or evolve our training to ensure that they're equipped for climate change adaptation and mitigation?
Well, I'd like to just go back to what Dr. Stevens said. We don't have to all be experts. That's the beauty of the One Health approach, is build your network, build your cadre of like-minded people that have different disciplinary expertise and use them and connect the next generation with them. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we equip the next generation with the mindset of, I don't have to do it all, and I know people in these different disciplines, or I know where to go find them so that I can have this healthy interaction that will focus not on necessarily the outcomes, because then we're like Chicken Little, the diseases are coming, the climate is changing, the ocean is going to suck us all up, right? Instead, on what baby steps we can do, how can we chip away at this problem, and how can we do it together? And I believe if you do that as a model for the next generation, and you actually bring those people in, that the next generation of folks that I work with are so much more knowledgeable about things that I just don't know about because I'm not on Instagram with them or whatever. So that I learn from them. Hopefully I give them some insight into some skill sets, but that also enriches your professional life and your personal life as you go, so that you don't feel so alone and so overwhelmed that you just want to make a difference and can't figure out how to do it.
I was just going to say that I think that we're sitting here with what I'm seeing is some of the experts in Canada who can really outline some of the targets for veterinarians at each one of those levels. So I find that, the rule of threes, three at the micro level, 3 at the meso level, 3 at the macro level. I'm putting together a ladder like that right now for global health professionals, and we're going to launch it. We've had a sort of a consultation process internationally to start it. We're building the back end of the website right now. We've got the networks in place, but really the thing I find is difficult for people when they're just entering is picking those targets. So if the experts here can help to really pick those targets for people so that it's at it's a big year. COP is coming up this year. There's the Biodiversity Summit. What is because I'm sure in your head, what you actually want people to be doing. So if you can put that forward and then start to make the materials, I really find I've been going through a lot of the movement building and social change literature lately, and there's a concept in sustainability science it's learning sustainability through real world experiments. And I was like, oh, that's what I've been doing this whole time, because I've really found that since I've been teaching by asking people to do stuff, instead of asking them to, for instance, give a presentation at rounds at their hospital, which is what I was doing before, the doing stuff, it's very much aligned with the problem-based learning sort of teaching concept, which is how we teach medical students now. And people just get so excited about it because then you're doing things and then you see actual real world change and you're like, oh, I can do this. And you've learned some skill sets along the way. You've actually learned the material along the way. So I think that if you can help them figure out what that engagement ladder is and help provide some of the tools, you'll start making, and make sure you tell the stories of your wins. It's not bragging, it's inspiring people. So create the forum so that people can tell those stories and you can keep encouraging one another. I think there's tremendous amount this community can do.
I guess I'll throw my 2 cents in. As I said to you earlier, every week I decide if I'm going to quit. I objectively look at my career as a complete failure. I've worked on wildlife and the extinction crisis is accelerating. I've worked on global health and security, and we've got international pandemics. We have great food insecurity issues. I've worked on all these sorts of things that you could sort of say it's got worse. So it's depressing. And to put this onto yourself is tough. But it's not tough when you think your job is to keep animals well. So yes, we have to take them away from illness back to wellness, but you only have control over 2 things, what you say and what you do, right? And so, what can I do in my practice to incrementally make the world a little bit better place by what I do, how I go out to farm calls, how I ask my clients to come, my supply chain, my heating sources. Those little things like that you can look at. You can start to ask, I describe my career slowly stepping away from the cow, right? I was trained to have my hand on the animals, right, as a clinician. And that's largely what it is. Even in herd health, I had my hand on that cow and I looked at the herd. And then I sort of got brave enough to say, well, let me look around the cow's circumstances. So I could look at the barn, and then I look, so I'm doing herd health now. Then let me back to the farm. So my whole career has been taking that step away. The key is to understand where along that chain from your hand on the cow to back up and whatever international policy, you feel comfortable and capable of making a change, whether it's in your personal life, whether it's your practice life, or the way you interact with your clients. That's the key thing. We've got to get past, Jonna laughs about, good old antiquated Craigus, James Harriet out in the backwoods or wherever. We've got to get past that model the veterinarians do. Every veterinarian does every aspect of animal well-being for every species. Where are you good? Where can you make the difference that's important to you? So that in fact, we can incrementally keep things better. And fundamentally, where you have the best control is giving animals options to respond to what might come. That option is a physiological option by keeping them well. That option is an information option for their owners so they can make decisions that are good for the animals and good for the next animals that come along as well. The implications of dietary choices for your pets, implications of housing choices for the cattle, the implications of habitat control for wildlife health. So think about that. Think about what's in your span of control. It's back to being the firefighter, right? When I was a firefighter, we're fighting a fire. When I was a firefighter, I didn't do rescue, fire attack, ventilation, and supply chain. I did one part of it. And I did that well. And as a team, we got things better. And I think as a profession, we can be a team that works together to move us to this new reality that we're going to have to deal with.
Great, thank you. So I see we're running out of time today, so I'm going to wrap us up for our 2021 forum. So I'd like to sincerely thank our speakers for sharing their knowledge and experience with us today and engaging in such a rich discussion. And then I would also like to thank all the participants, which unfortunately I can't see, but for taking part in this important issue and being part of the dialogue. So we know, as we've seen today, the climate crisis is the issue at the heart of many other issues that we face in veterinary medicine, and something that we as a profession have been and will continue to be challenged with in the coming years. So as leaders in our community, we can be agents of change for both adaptation and mitigation of climate change and find where we fit and where we can make a difference. So I hope that you can take some time to reflect on this discussion that occurred today and how you may be called to action, where you fit. I know I certainly will. And I look forward to further opportunities to continue this dialogue. So before we wrap up today, for those of you who are Cvma members, I'd like to remind you that beginning at 12 noon, so in 15 minutes, the Cvma annual general meeting is going to begin virtually. So thank you again, everyone, and I hope you have a really enjoyable and productive conference.